okay, I sort of feel like saying it now to something completely different, because we come from a very heavily industry-orientated, quite structured, quite legalistic perspective. Just wait till everybody sits down. With children, young people, and media, and a lot of it has been, although not, I wouldn't say exactly in ethnography, it's been ethnographic in the sense that I've worked in the same locations with the same people. Sometimes, in fact, my best story is with someone I interviewed now, going on 15 years ago, when I was doing my initial work on young people in Hindi film, has now had a child, and her child has been part of my work, and he's 6 years old, and he's soon to be 7, and so it goes. So people who continue as part of this work, I consider that to be a form of ethnography, although it's not the same as living in India and doing it all the time, because I visit and I spend time with them. Things change, and then I need those changes to be explained. So I don't consider myself to be an expert on every context, but the ones that I have worked in, which I describe here, are mainly Maharashtra and Gujarat, but also on occasion in Kerala and in Uttarakhand, in a very small, quite remote village, which is now not so remote as when I first started working there. And some of the stuff that I've done there is based on interviews, some of it is based on focus groups, and it crosses class lines. So here I have to say I really take a very different perspective from the perhaps top-down media initiatives that we've been hearing about, in the sense that I'm looking at the other 5/6 of the population as well as the expected or the usual suspects. And I'm going to try and cover both types of people in the conversation, because both of them are not present in the room today. By their very nature, children tend not to be invited to academic conferences unless they come as representatives of some form of participatory communication, and in which case they tend to be mouthpieces for something or the other. So this work basically started with the kind of irritation at the binary discourses in almost all the sociological literature on media in India. So the effects paradigm, and throughout the 70s and 80s, the whole notion that advertising was entering India, that it was poisoning the minds of people, turning them into a consumerist society, that there was a sense in which the discourse of risk and the discourse of behavior change went hand in hand. So this effects discourse, which argued that here come the media and then people are going to change, either positively in terms of the old state suggesting messages, or negatively in terms of a kind of cultural imperialism and a westernization. And this has taken a whole long trajectory right up to where we are today in 2014, with the notion that the internet is a youth medium and young people can go on it and do whatever they want. And this has been mirrored in the second field in which I work, which is not media communications but development studies, in this huge modernization push around media and communications in India, with the notion that all innovation in technology, particularly now around the internet, is good for governance, good for the economy, and good for the public. So we've ended up at a place where somehow the other technology is somehow equaling democracy. This, of course, is not just India. This mirrors the picture in media and communications departments across the US, in many parts of Australia, in the UK. There are critical departments, but it's very difficult to find people who don't, at some level, when they come to talk about children and youth, suddenly let go of all their critique and fall back on essentialist assumptions about particular types of humanity. So here, for instance, is the notion that mass media in general are really bad for children and youth. And in any given classroom or lecture which I give, if I take a straw poll of people who say that they would let their 6-year-old watch any pornography online, you'll get virtually nobody saying yes. And when you say, would you watch pornography online? Most of them shyly say yes. Okay, so basically people think children develop from being 6-year-olds who need to be protected, and that media is addictive or dangerous in some way. So this is an assumption. I would contest it, but you can come and talk to me outside about letting your 6-year-old watch porn. Okay, old media, i.e. the radio, the internet, the radio, the television, is inherently passive, and this was popularized by Tapscott, and it absolutely crosses departments in the UK, now to the extent that people are almost not studying old media anymore because they just put the label passive and they stopped studying it. Somehow young people are now the digital natives, and this is another very resilient discourse. And finally, coming out of India and politics, is the notion that young people are somehow participating in politics online and shaping things, but in a very uncivic way. So the notion of the Modi effect, which was everywhere in the press with absolutely no evidence given behind it. If you want to talk about the link to children and the media economy, it's in almost every publication you will find people suggesting that ratings is what the media in India are chasing now. And of course, you get ratings when you make sensational stories, when you put content which appeals to the middle classes, to the people who want to sell and buy products. So here, for instance, in a very extensive and actually a very good report by Internews Europe on child rights in the news, you have the following notion that a lack of consumer interest in child issues is the single most pressing reason why virtually no media outlet, whether in print or electronic source, has any interest in child rights. And we are talking about child rights in middle-class families, child rights in relation to sexual abuse, child rights in relation to working-class children working in unsanitary or hazardous conditions. No interest whatsoever. And if you can count probably on your hand the number of stories you've seen in the Indian media in the last year on those topics, then you can probably count 10,000 stories you've seen about the kinds of clothing or speeches given by our various politicians in contrast. So being media rich or media poor has many different dimensions. It works across representation, it works across technology, it works across access and region, and it affects the notion of what is leisure and what is consumption. Media itself produces many of these discourses, and again, scholars who are critical in relation to media in relation to producers, scholars who are critical in relation to media in relation to addiction or politics with adults, suddenly lose all their inhibitions and simply refer back to the media itself when they're talking about children and childhood, and when they're talking about what children do with technology. So they don't seem to need any evidence based on methodologies or based on data gathered by themselves. So middle and upper middle class children and child rearing in India, without question, is a huge big business. I'm not going to ask all of you whether you have children and what you do with them, but I'm pretty sure it's similar to the kinds of things that I and various friends that I know do with our children. You know, they go to particular kinds of schools, they have particular technologies. The 2-year-old tablet generation they are now. And this is the demographic that tends to be surveyed most by market research companies. They're big business. This is the demographic that gets printed up on Rediff.com and Yahoo.com and AOL. This is the demographic that Western researchers pick up on when they're thinking about childhood in India and when they're thinking about toddlers and tablets. And they talk about this in a way which suggests this is the only demographic which has a voice in relation to media in the West. Thus they come to represent India in the minds of people who don't see India as only an impoverished morass. So we have two discourses. India, the poor in need of development, and India shining with its tablets and its mobile phones. I'll talk to you first about the usual suspects. So my research with children is very meaning orientated in the sense that I talk to children about what they make of media and how they view it and where they view it and what they like watching best. And so during the last 10 years, of course, this has changed, but also it's remained quite similar. I mean, we had a presentation on animation. Animation is understandably one of the most widely watched and most widely allowed genres amongst children. Of course, we have lots of Bollywood films and lots of serials which are also watched, but both indigenized and foreign animations are huge, and they are full of all kinds of political discourses. If adults had any sense, and if adults like us had any sense, we would be studying a lot more than we do. So for instance, huge assertions about national superiority in almost every single one of the indigenized serials. Constant references to women's purity, girls' purity, to honor, to the need to save and protect girls and thus the nation. Constant references to a mythical historical past. Probably if you've been watching serials way back in 97 and 98 the way I was, you could have predicted what was going to happen in Gujarat, and you might well have predicted the 2014 election. Because think about all those children then who are now adults and drawn into what appears to be a Twitter effect, but actually is a television effect, which has been going for a very, very long time. So there's a total erasure in these programs of any sort of internal ethno-religious conflict. We will erase the events that are going on in our midst. There's also an erasure of any kind of caste or class, except for the serials in which caste is cast as an idyllic pre-capitalist thing which somehow is very Indian and needs to be sold to the rest of the world in some form. And finally, there's a huge emphasis on faith and magic versus science, rationality and technology, next to the ad breaks in which there's a huge emphasis on science, rationality, technology and consumption, and no mention of magic or faith. So we've got these consecutive things going on in children's minds. So you might think that all these children are simply consuming this if we think about the effects paradigm and turning into little consumers, little nationalists, but actually it's not true, and children use these programs in many different ways. In fact, they use them in ways which are critical of their parents, sometimes critical of their parents' discourses. So where Indian families in general don't talk about sex, you will have children discussing sex between themselves between the ages of 11 and 15 because they've watched particular types of films or programs. May not please the parents amongst you, but it is a fact, and I've had hundreds of discussions with them of this nature. Where programs and serials will raise issues about girls' autonomy, it's something that they don't talk about or discuss with their friends and relatives. So it's something that comes up in their minds, and parents see this as a cause of conflict, not always in a pleasant or pleasurable way. Children are also not simply dupes of commercial culture. They find the advertisements irritating. They have a political economy approach to the advertisements which come in their programs. They actually understand that the programs are being made through the advertisements. And here we have an 11-year-old telling you basically what we've just been hearing today, that our programs are funded, our games are funded through the various kinds of company advertisements that come. And when asked about what they think is the alternative, they say nothing, because otherwise all we'll get is the sad things that our parents want us to see. And that is worse than watching the advertisements. Of course, if you're with the usual suspects, the middle and upper middle class children, the several million of them, they're on Instagram, they're on Facebook, they're on WhatsApp, they're doing all kinds of things, they're communicating with each other all the time, night and day, they often sleep with their cell phones. But this is the group that gets surveyed. This is the group that everybody knows. They're also doing other things. They're also absorbing a sort of one-click everyday politics which comes to form the Indian public sphere, which everyone talks about as the only public sphere in India. So they talk about gang rape on there, or they don't talk about it, they simply pass on memes about it. If you look at these memes, you'll see that one of them is Hitler dominates the world, German army, Nazi reign, at Nazi reign. This was a hugely popular meme, probably shared over 1 million times, okay, by 12 to 15-year-olds. If nobody finds that troubling, fine, but nobody seems to find it troubling. Adults don't seem to find it troubling. Goes to the Indian police to report a gang rape, gets gang raped by police, and then various comments underneath like, ha ha, too true, so sad, India all over. You know, okay, so there's a sort of discourse around these things. And then you can see the last one. So these kinds of memes are shared. And if you think that's the only child audience, that's really problematic, because there's a huge swathe which is outside of that. So in order to de-essentialize, in order to undercut those discourses which we saw at the beginning, the modernization one, the essential one about children, we need to think about caste and class hierarchies. We need to think about the ways in which children are not at leisure, in fact not allowed to have leisure. I thought it was hugely ironic that I was invited to present at a conference on leisure when the children I study virtually have no leisure. When the children, even the middle class children, or the WhatsApp children, have virtually no leisure. They're in rote learning situations, they're in classrooms, they're doing extra classes, they are looking after younger siblings almost all of the day and night. They're in a hugely disciplinarian and authoritarian climate, which I have called in discourses with various friends a form of micro-fascism, which they experience on a daily basis. So the thought that somehow they're chewing bubble gum and watching films and running around the streets with balloons and balls is actually hugely mistaken. And then there's the other 79% who I haven't heard anything about in discourses today. So amongst most working class children, both in rural and urban areas, and we are talking about nearly 300 million children. So if you want statistics, here's statistics from the Asian Development Bank report. It's actually grown, so this is larger in the 2014 version. The media environment is comparatively circumscribed. Very little television, if at all, very little cell phones. Virtually nobody in a whole village will have had access to a cell phone. Maybe occasional access to a computer, but no internet. Many people didn't even know what the internet was. Few radios, and so on and so on. So I could paint a very bleak picture of what their lives are like, but actually it's not quite like that. So leisure is something quite de-linked from media in their lives. They go to informal schools, which are run by volunteers, where there's a sort of ad hoc pedagogy, which includes media but also doesn't include media. So they have little comics which they fill in, shapes that they draw in, that's the kind of media. They also present their space in a very positive way. So actually having space, having some kind of privacy, is seen as a form of leisure. So actually going from a place where there are many people into a space where there is no one or just one other person is leisure to the people I talked about. Consumption to these people, described again and again and again by domestic workers, by boys who work on the street, by people who push wheelbarrows, by those who sell you vegetables and flowers, by those who clean the courtyard when you're not here, was described as "Un log hame kha raha hai." They are eating us. We are being consumed. That was their notion of consumption. So a conference on consumption, which assumes that they consume the media that you adults make for them, is positively revolting to me, if we don't consider all the child labor that goes into making these PCs, that goes into making the smartphones we're talking about and celebrating all of the time. So here they are making garlands, making chains, doing things on a daily basis. And here they are, completely without media, completely without electricity, playing games and taking leisure in some way. Doing games that probably you played in your childhood. And on the street, completely destitute children with absolutely no access to media, certainly no access to cell phones, playing marbles the way people did 100 years ago. So in that context, the salience of available media changes. And if you actually look quite carefully at these pictures, you'll see that one of the boys has a cell phone. Nicole, this boy, has a cell phone. It's very small, and he plays things like Tetris on it. And he does this all the time. This is 2014. So people often ask me, well, haven't things changed? Surely that must be a photograph from 10 years ago. Actually, it's not. It's a photograph from 2014. And where things are positioned, for instance, where loudspeakers are positioned within homes, where televisions are positioned, are also hugely symbolic in these children's lives, because they're often never turned on. They're simply up in a corner, and there's no connection. There's no, since the digital switchover, and I know some of you are studying this, there is no digital. So they have lost their connection to television, which was the only medium that they actually had before. New media, quite understandably, but also very frighteningly to someone like me, is big, big business. And sadly, in all the work I've done, and all the people I've encountered, NGOs and CSOs and people who work for other disinterested philanthropic organizations are playing a very dangerous ideological role in conduiting new technologies to poor people in some way, with absolutely no changes to the content, with absolutely no interest in vernacular languages, with absolutely no interest in those children's everyday realities and their lives. So they're basically assisting us academics in selling new media to people for whom it may not be very good at all. So I'm going to conclude with 3 slides on which I make a series of more theoretical, wider, broader points. How we see and imagine things as academics circumscribes the world and the research that we do. So I am very critical of us as a field, of media and communications as a field, and of development as a field. I see very, very few practices amongst us as academics to be proud of. Although Instagram and WhatsApp may well be where some young Indians are at, that's actually a tiny intergenerational minority, and it's more middle and upper middle class adults than anybody else who are actually in that place. The young people who are there courtesy of their parents' wealth, their parents' position in India. Conceptualizing all youth and children, therefore, given that 300 million children don't even have televisions or radios, conceiving them as the digital generation is absurd and dangerous. I suggest that the oldest of all possible social categorizations, if you like, we need to go back to class and think about it very creatively in relation to media. The leisure media nexus that this conference is prefaced on is really class-specific. It hits a particular group of people whom we identify with in a particular way. So living in a small space with loads of other people in a remote place, coming back from having been beaten by your teacher because you didn't hand in something because you were in the fields the day before, is the experience of a majority of India. Not of us, but of a majority of India. And once you're in that context, what you do with media is very textured. And I suggest that actually what you do is a form of calculated conformity. When an adult comes along and says to you, would you like a computer? You just nod your head. And what would you do with a computer in that context? Media and consumption has to be evaluated in relation to political concepts like social reproduction, the reproduction of caste and class, and gender relationships within families. A sort of banal politics, if you like, which very few of us consider. We are only interested in Twitter and big data and those kinds of statistics now, which I think is very dangerous, perhaps very untactical of us in some way. So, finally, we need to decenter adults in all of these theorizations. If you're talking about political economy, it's very tempting to go for the big statistics, and it's very easy to forget the old communicative assemblages, which actually have caused riots and also caused dance parties, such as neighborhood loudspeakers, which are on pretty much every street corner and everywhere you go in India and don't really cost that much money. So actually I'm suggesting we decenter the electronic media, the new media, from a lot of these debates and think much, much more carefully about the kind of research direction that we are going in as a field. Thank you.
Thank you.